My name is Edward Calloway, and I am 76 years old. 3 months ago, at a family dinner celebrating my granddaughter's college acceptance, my son-in-law and I had a brief conversation about retirement planning, during which he asked, casually, how my own savings were positioned. I gave him a general, modest answer, and he laughed, not unkindly exactly, and told his brother, seated beside him, that my savings probably weren't enough to matter much in the grand scheme of things, that men of my generation who spent their careers in manufacturing rarely retired with anything beyond a modest pension and a paid-off house. 6 weeks later, his company's auditors, conducting a routine review ahead of a major acquisition, found my name on the original licensing contract underlying nearly a third of the company's current patent portfolio. A document signed in 1987 that had, quietly and continuously, been generating royalty payments directly to me for nearly 4 decades. If you've ever had your entire life's work reduced to a dismissive assumption by someone who never once asked a real question, stay with me until the end. This story isn't about proving my son-in-law wrong. It's about what happens when quiet, patient work, sustained across decades, finally intersects, unexpectedly, with the very people who assumed it never amounted to much at all. Welcome to Silent Honor USA. If this story speaks to you, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly what that auditor found. I need to tell you about my career before I tell you about that dinner table, because otherwise the contract won't mean what it's supposed to mean. I trained as a mechanical engineer, graduating in 1971 from a state university outside of Cleveland, Ohio, and I spent the following decade and a half working for a mid-sized industrial equipment manufacturer, gaining, across those years, a genuine, deep expertise in precision hydraulic systems, the kind of unglamorous, highly technical work that rarely translates into anything resembling a dinner party story, but that quietly shapes an enormous amount of the industrial infrastructure most people never think twice about. In the early 1980s, working largely on my own time, evenings and weekends spent in a small workshop I'd built in my garage, I developed a specific mechanical innovation, a valve regulation system that solved a persistent efficiency problem in hydraulic press equipment, a problem that had frustrated engineers across the industry for years without anyone quite landing on an elegant, cost-effective solution. I remember specifically the particular satisfaction of that breakthrough, a Sunday evening in late 1983, working through a problem I'd been circling for months, when a specific configuration of valve timing finally clicked into place in my thinking, the kind of moment engineers live for, when an abstract, frustrating puzzle suddenly resolves into something elegant and workable. I want to be honest that I didn't fully understand, at the time, the actual significance of what I'd developed. It felt, in the moment, like solving an interesting puzzle rather than creating something that would eventually matter to an entire industry. Doreen, I remember, brought me coffee out to that garage workshop more evenings than I could count during those years, and she was the first person to see the working prototype once I'd built it, standing beside me as I demonstrated the specific efficiency improvement it provided over standard configurations. She had a genuine talent for understanding, even without formal engineering training herself, exactly why a given technical solution mattered, and her early enthusiastic response to that prototype gave me confidence. During a period when I genuinely wasn't certain whether the innovation represented anything more than an interesting personal accomplishment. I filed a patent for that innovation in 1985, working with a patent attorney I'd found through a colleague's recommendation, a process that took nearly 2 years to finalize, during which I continued working my regular engineering job, treating the eventual patent as a modest side project rather than anything I expected to fundamentally change my financial circumstances. In 1987, a small but ambitious industrial technology company, then barely 5 years old and operating out of a modest facility outside of Columbus, approached me about licensing that patent for use in a new line of hydraulic equipment they were developing, equipment that would eventually become foundational to their entire product catalog. I negotiated, with the help of that same patent attorney, a licensing agreement that provided me a modest upfront payment along with an ongoing royalty structure, a small percentage of revenue generated by any product incorporating my specific valve regulation innovation, structured to continue for the full life of the patent and any subsequent related patents the company developed building on that original foundation. I want to be honest about something that matters enormously to understanding the rest of this story. I never expected that small company to become what it eventually became. In 1987, it was a modest, regional operation with perhaps 30 employees, competing against considerably larger, more established manufacturers. I signed that licensing agreement expecting, at best, a modest supplemental income stream alongside my regular engineering salary, never imagining that the company would grow, over the following decades, into a genuinely significant player in industrial hydraulic equipment, eventually operating internationally, with a product catalog built substantially on foundational technology that traced directly back to that original 1987 agreement. That company is called Meridian Hydraulics, and I want to tell you now, because it matters directly to the rest of this story, that my son-in-law Gregory has worked for Meridian Hydraulics for the past 11 years, currently serving as a senior operations director, entirely unaware, across the full length of his employment there, that the original licensing agreement underlying a substantial portion of the company's foundational patent portfolio bore my signature. I never mentioned this connection to Gregory, or to my daughter Patricia, in any detail, partly because the royalty payments, while genuinely significant over the decades, had become, for me, simply a quiet, background element of my financial life rather than something I felt any particular need to discuss at family gatherings. I retired from my regular engineering career in 2011, at 62, and since then, I've lived a comfortable but genuinely modest lifestyle in the same house I've owned for over 3 decades, driving a practical, older sedan, wearing simple, durable clothing, giving no outward indication whatsoever of the actual financial position those decades of quiet royalty payments had built. My wife, Doreen, passed 5 years ago, and she had, throughout our 43 years of marriage, a full understanding of the actual financial picture, having been present for the original 1987 negotiation, and having managed, alongside me, the careful, conservative investment of those royalty payments over the following decades. Doreen worked as a high school mathematics teacher for most of her own career, and she brought that same careful, methodical discipline to our household finances that she brought to her classroom, tracking every royalty payment, researching investment options with a thoroughness that consistently outpaced my own more casual approach to financial planning. She used to gently tease me, more than once over the years, about my particular reluctance to discuss our actual financial position with anyone outside our immediate household, a habit she attributed to my engineering temperament, more comfortable with precise technical problems than with the particular social calculus of when and how to reveal significant financial information to family members. I remember, specifically, a conversation with Doreen sometime in the early 2000s, when Patricia was still in her 20s and beginning to think seriously about her own financial future, and Doreen suggested we might consider sharing more details of our actual financial position with her, wanting Patricia to understand the full scope of what patient, disciplined saving could accomplish over decades. I resisted that suggestion at the time, preferring to keep our privacy intact, a decision I've thought about often in the years since, wondering whether a different choice, made decades earlier, might have prevented the specific misunderstanding that eventually unfolded at that family dinner 3 months ago. Patricia, my daughter, grew up with a general understanding that her father was an engineer who'd developed some kind of patent early in his career, a fact mentioned occasionally but never explored in any real detail, absorbed into her general understanding of me the way children absorb most facts about their parents' careers, as background information rather than anything requiring deeper investigation. She married Gregory about 15 years ago, and Gregory, over the following years, developed his own career trajectory largely independent of any awareness of my specific financial circumstances, working his way up through several manufacturing companies before landing, 11 years ago, at Meridian Hydraulics, a position he'd been genuinely proud to secure, given the company's growing reputation within the industry. I want to be fair to Gregory here because it would be easy to paint him simply as callous, and that isn't the complete picture of who he actually is. He's been, in most respects, a devoted husband to Patricia and an attentive father to their two children, my grandchildren. What I've noticed over the years of Gregory and Patricia's marriage is a particular, fairly common assumption Gregory has carried about my generation and my career specifically, a category-based judgment that men who'd spent their working lives as engineers in manufacturing, rather than in more visibly lucrative fields like finance or corporate law, generally retired into modest, unremarkable financial circumstances, an assumption that had never once been directly tested against my actual situation, simply because the topic had never arisen in a context that required correction. 3 months ago, we gathered for a family dinner at Patricia and Gregory's house, celebrating my granddaughter Emily's acceptance into a competitive engineering program, a milestone I found genuinely moving, given the particular symmetry of watching a third generation move toward the same field that had shaped so much of my own life. The dinner itself was warm and celebratory, Patricia having prepared a genuinely elaborate meal in Emily's honor, and I found myself enjoying the evening considerably, listening to Emily describe her excitement about the program with an enthusiasm that reminded me powerfully of my own early career, sitting in that same garage workshop decades earlier, certain that engineering represented the most interesting way a person could spend a working life. About halfway through the evening, during a lull in the broader conversation, Gregory turned to me with what seemed like genuine, if somewhat casual, curiosity, asking how my own retirement savings were positioned, mentioning that he and Patricia had recently been reviewing their own long-term financial planning and were curious how previous generations in the family had approached similar questions. I noticed, even in that moment, a certain lightness in how he asked the question, the particular casual confidence of a man who assumed he already understood the general shape of the answer before I'd even provided it. I gave my usual modest answer, something general about having saved reasonably well across my engineering career, without volunteering the specific details of the royalty structure that had actually shaped the bulk of my financial position over the decades. Gregory nodded, and then, turning to his brother Marcus, who was visiting from out of state and seated beside him, made a comment that landed with a particular weight I hadn't anticipated. Yeah, I mean, Edward's savings are probably fine, but let's be honest, they're probably not enough to matter much in the grand scheme of things. Guys from his generation who spent their careers in manufacturing, they usually retire with a decent pension and a paid-off house, and that's basically it. Nothing dramatic. Not exactly the kind of money that changes anything for anybody. Marcus laughed, and Gregory laughed along with him, the easy, careless laughter of two men discussing a category rather than a specific person seated directly across the table from them. Emily continuing to eat her dessert nearby, apparently not registering the exchange as anything significant. I sat there, holding my wine glass, absorbing the particular sting of having 4 decades of quiet, careful engineering work that had in fact generated financial resources considerably more significant than either man had any reason to suspect, casually dismissed as insufficient to matter in any meaningful way. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't primarily anger. Men of my generation, particularly engineers accustomed to having our specific technical contributions consistently underappreciated by people who don't understand the actual mechanics of what we've built, develop a certain capacity to absorb this kind of comment without much visible reaction. What I felt was something quieter and more specific, a tired, familiar recognition of exactly how completely my own chosen discretion, across decades, had shaped my own family's understanding of who I actually was and what I'd actually built. I didn't correct him. I simply nodded, made a mild comment about every generation approaching finances differently, and let the conversation move on to other topics, the way these moments often do, absorbed back into the general flow of a celebratory family dinner rather than confronted directly. What happened next, I want to be absolutely clear, was not something I orchestrated in any way. I had no advanced knowledge whatsoever that it was coming, and the actual mechanics of how it unfolded matter considerably to understanding why it carried the weight it did. About 6 weeks after that dinner, Meridian Hydraulics entered into serious acquisition discussions with a considerably larger international industrial conglomerate, a deal that, Gregory later told me, represented a potentially transformative moment for the company and, by extension, for his own career trajectory within it. As part of the standard due diligence process ahead of any acquisition of this scale, the acquiring company's legal and financial teams conducted an exhaustive audit of Meridian Hydraulics' entire patent portfolio, tracing the origin and current licensing status of every foundational technology underlying the company's product catalog. During that audit, the acquiring company's legal team discovered, and flagged for detailed review, the original 1987 licensing agreement underlying the valve regulation technology that had become foundational to nearly a third of Meridian's current patent portfolio, technology that, over the following decades, had been continuously refined and built upon, generating an entire family of related patents that traced their origin directly back to my original innovation. Gregory called me on a Tuesday evening, roughly 6 weeks after that family dinner, his voice carrying an unusual, careful tension I didn't immediately recognize, entirely different from his typically relaxed, confident phone manner. "Edward," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me, because this is genuinely important for something happening at work right now. Did you develop a valve regulation patent back in the 1980s? Something related to hydraulic press systems?" I felt my chest tighten slightly, understanding immediately where this conversation was heading, a strange, disorienting mixture of inevitability and surprise settling over me even as I processed his question. "I did," I said. "Filed it in 1985, licensed it to a small company called Meridian Hydraulics in 1987. There was a long, stunned silence on the line, long enough that I could hear, faintly, sounds of Gregory's home office in the background, a chair creaking as he apparently sat down heavily. "Edward, that's my company. That's the company I've worked at for 11 years. The acquisition team's auditors found your name on the original licensing agreement this afternoon." "Edward, that patent, and the related patents that came out of it over the years, they're foundational to nearly a third of our entire current product catalog. This is a genuinely massive discovery for the deal team right now, and I had absolutely no idea, in 11 years of working here, that you were connected to any of it." I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, hearing my son-in-law's genuine shock, the particular disorientation of a man realizing that a piece of information he'd casually dismissed weeks earlier, my father-in-law's supposedly unremarkable retirement savings, had actually been sitting, quietly, at the foundational core of the very company that employed him, a company whose success had, in some meaningful sense, been shaping his own career trajectory for over a decade, without his ever knowing the specific source of the technology underlying so much of what he'd built his professional life around. "Gregory," I said, "I've been receiving royalty payments from that licensing agreement continuously since 1987, nearly 4 decades now. I never mentioned it because it never felt like the kind of thing that came up naturally in conversation, and because, frankly, Doreen and I always preferred to keep our financial position private rather than discussed openly at family gatherings." "Edward," Gregory said, his voice still carrying evident shock, "at dinner 6 weeks ago, I told Marcus your savings probably weren't enough to matter much. I said that in front of you, directly, assuming I understood your entire financial situation, because you fit a category in my head: retired manufacturing engineer, modest pension, paid-off house. I had no idea I was sitting across the table from a man whose royalty income has probably shaped this company's entire trajectory more significantly than most of the executives currently running it. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. My first instinct was not entirely generous. Part of me wanted to let the discomfort of that realization sit a while longer. Let Gregory fully absorb the weight of what he'd said, casually and dismissively, weeks earlier, without any real knowledge of what he was actually dismissing. But I thought of Doreen and the particular grace she always modeled in difficult family moments, and I found something steadier instead. "Gregory," I said, "I'm not upset that you didn't know the specifics. I never gave you any reason to know them, and that's genuinely on me as much as it's on you. But I do think it's worth sitting with something important. Not because I want to punish you, but because I think it matters. You made an assumption about my entire financial worth based on a category, retired manufacturing engineer, without ever asking a single direct question that might have revealed a fuller picture. That's a pattern worth examining, Gregory, independent of whatever this specific discovery reveals about my own particular circumstances. You're right, Gregory said, his voice thick with what sounded like genuine, complicated emotion. I think I've spent years measuring people's worth through fairly narrow, visible categories, and I never once considered that someone's actual financial and professional impact might be considerably larger than whatever surface-level assumption I'd built about them. I'm ashamed of that comment, Edward, especially now, understanding what you've actually contributed to the very company I work for. We talked for nearly an hour that evening, a conversation considerably more honest than anything Gregory and I had managed across 15 years of his marriage to my daughter. I told him, in detail I'd never previously shared with anyone in the family beyond Doreen, about the specific technical problem I'd solved in that garage workshop, about the careful, conservative investment strategy that had allowed those royalty payments to compound significantly over nearly 4 decades, about the deliberate choice Doreen and I had made, early in our marriage, to live modestly, regardless of our actual financial position, valuing privacy and stability over any visible display of the resources we'd actually accumulated. I explained, too, how Doreen and I had specifically decided, years earlier, to structure our estate planning so that Patricia would eventually understand the full financial picture, though we'd never settled on the right moment to have that conversation while we were both still living, a delay that, I acknowledged to Gregory, had probably contributed directly to the very misunderstanding that had just unfolded so publicly. Gregory, for his part, described the specific shock of sitting in a conference room that afternoon, watching senior executives at Meridian Hydraulics react with visible astonishment as the legal team explained the significance of the original 1987 agreement, several of them asking, repeatedly, whether the Edward Calloway on the document was somehow connected to Gregory's own family, a connection Gregory himself had needed several minutes to fully process before confirming. I sat there, Edward, hearing my own colleagues discuss you with this kind of reverence, people who've built their entire careers around understanding patent value and technical innovation, and I kept thinking about that dinner conversation 6 weeks ago, replaying exactly how carelessly I'd talked about you, and I felt genuinely sick about it. The acquisition deal, once Meridian's leadership team fully understood the significance of the original licensing agreement, actually became considerably more complicated, requiring my direct involvement in renegotiating certain terms of my ongoing royalty structure to ensure it would properly transfer under the acquiring company's ownership, a process I worked through carefully with legal counsel over the following several weeks, a process that gave Gregory, for the first time, direct visibility into the actual scope of what those decades of quiet engineering work had built. In the 3 months since that discovery, something has genuinely shifted in how Gregory relates to me. He's asked, more than once, real questions about my engineering career, about the specific technical problem I'd solved, about what it had actually felt like watching a small, modest side project from a garage workshop eventually become foundational to an entire industry's approach to hydraulic efficiency. He visited my house last month specifically to see the original workshop, still largely intact in my garage, and spent nearly 2 hours examining old tools and prototype pieces I'd kept over the decades, asking careful, genuinely engaged questions about the specific engineering challenges I'd navigated during that original development process. He mentioned, during that same visit, that his own understanding of what genuine, lasting value actually looks like had shifted considerably, moving away from the kind of visible, immediately impressive markers he'd previously used to measure people's significance. I think, he said, standing in that garage workshop, I've spent my whole career around people who talk constantly about their accomplishments, deals closed, promotions earned, and I built a mental shortcut where visible discussion equals actual significance. You never once mentioned any of this, Edward, not because it wasn't significant, but because you never needed anyone's validation to know its worth. I think that's a considerably more mature relationship with accomplishment than the one I've been operating with. Patricia told me, during a phone call last week, that Gregory had specifically apologized to her privately as well, acknowledging that the assumption he'd carried about my generation and my career had reflected a broader pattern in how he measured people's worth, one he was actively trying to examine and correct, not just regarding me specifically, but more broadly in how he approached colleagues and family members whose actual contributions might not be immediately visible on the surface. She mentioned that he'd started, in small ways, asking more genuine questions of people at Meridian whose backgrounds he'd previously never bothered to explore. Wondering, he told her, how many other quiet, significant contributions were sitting unnoticed throughout the company's history, simply because nobody had thought to ask. Emily, my granddaughter, has asked me, more than once since that discovery, to tell her more about the specific engineering problem I'd solved, wanting to understand the technical details as she begins her own engineering education. A connection between generations that feels, given everything that's happened, considerably more meaningful than it might have felt before this entire situation unfolded. She's asked, specifically, if she could bring some of my old notebooks and prototype sketches to show a professor she particularly admires, wanting to demonstrate, in her words, that genuinely significant engineering work sometimes starts in the most unremarkable places, a garage workshop rather than a corporate research lab, patient curiosity rather than institutional prestige. I don't tell you this story because I want sympathy for an old engineer whose savings were casually dismissed at a family dinner. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something important. Genuine value, the kind built through decades of careful, patient work, doesn't always announce itself in ways that fit neatly into the categories other people use to measure worth. Real respect requires resisting the temptation to assume you fully understand someone's life based on a general category, and having the humility to ask real questions before drawing conclusions about what someone else has or hasn't actually built. I spent decades quietly receiving royalty payments from an innovation most of my own family knew almost nothing about, while being casually categorized as someone whose savings probably weren't enough to matter much in the grand scheme of things. It took an unexpected acquisition audit, entirely outside my control, to finally reveal exactly how wrong that casual assumption had been. But it's taken the months since, conversation by conversation, for that revelation to become the kind of genuine, lasting understanding that a single dramatic discovery alone could never fully provide on its own. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life whose actual worth you might not fully understand, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe, because we have a new story like this one every week.